Hello, everybody. Well, it's only five of you. I wanted to do, like I did with 2R, do a quick overview of chapter 36, which is called New Conflagrations, World War II and the Cold War. Um, it's always been interesting to me that our text authors, Bentley, Street Salter, decided to do World War II and the Cold War into one big chapter. Um, that's what we're looking at. We're almost done with the book. Um, this is information that that you guys are, well, at least if you were with me in 4L, you're familiar with, and it hasn't been that long. Um, starting on 856. I mentioned this a couple of times. To get into World War II, our authors start out with Japan's actions in China in the mid 30s, taking over Manchuria, changing the name to Manchukuo, the rape of Nanjing, which is covered on or I'm sorry, not 657, 857. That lays the groundwork for them covering World War II, Japanese aggression in China, in the Pacific, and then German actions violating the Treaty of Versailles. And the reason I'm looking down, I'm just looking at our book right now. Germany violating the Treaty of Versailles, Germany taking the Sudetenland as a result of British and French appeasement in 1938, and then taking, wanting another section of Czechoslovakia in 39, and then invading Poland in September of 39, starting World War I. So that's talked about. 860 Total War is going to deal with German U-boats, the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, that aerial battle where the RAF is able to defeat the Luftwaffe. That's the first German defeat in World War II. And then it gets into Operation Barbarossa, or the invasion of the Soviet Union, which is the tragic error of Hitler's. Starts out well. By 43, the Battle of Stalingrad, the Germans start to be pushed back to the west. And in 44, when the Allies open up the Western European front at D-Day, they're fighting a two-front war, which they wanted to prevent the whole time. On 863, there's a picture from Pearl Harbor. So the United States gets in 1941. The United States is pretty much, financing and making, war materials for the Allied powers after, even before, but especially after its entrance into the war in 41. Defeat of the Axis powers. You could see there's a map on 865. It says high tide of Axis expansion into Europe and North Africa. Remember, the Americans went into North Africa first in 42, and then invaded up through what Winston Churchill famously called the soft underbelly of Europe, up through Italy in 43. We actually were defeated. The U.S. was defeated in those first battles in Africa in 42, but we learned from that. 867 is going to talk about life during wartime. It is going to talk a little bit about the Holocaust on 869, and the final solution. We get women's roles on 871, and then right after that we jump into the Cold War. Now the seeds of the Cold War are sown at a couple of the meetings between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt in Yalta in January, February of 45, and then at Potsdam once Truman's president at Potsdam. So they decide that they're going to, carve up Germany into territories, and Britain and France and the United States put their territory all together, and they make up what eventually becomes West Germany. The Soviet Union promises free elections, which they never have, which Stalin never holds in East Europe, and then the Soviet sphere of Germany becomes East Germany, or the GDR, the German Democratic Republic. It's an ironic name for it. And so Germany is split until, 89, 90, when Germany reunifies. And so the Cold War is talked about, the creation of the UN on 875. The UN is what the League of Nations really was supposed to be. Again, learning from previous mistakes, the world powers came together and said, we need an organization to kind of oversee affairs, and that became the UN, which is inaugurated in San Francisco in 45. We get the Marshall Plan on 877, which rebuilds Western Europe with American money. NATO and the Warsaw Pact. NATO and Warsaw Pact are both collective security alliances. An attack on one is an attack on all. NATO is instituted about 1949, I think. Yeah, 1949, according to the text. That's Western European nations. I don't think the Warsaw Pact starts until 55. Yep. And that's Eastern European nations. Berlin blockade is talked about in 877. That's Stalin blockading Europe, or blockading Germany, trying to drive the Allied powers out of Germany. That plan backfires with the Berlin airlift, where Harry Truman has the United States fly in supplies to the residents of Berlin. And then, it talks a little bit about McCarthyism on 878. And then the nuclear arms race in Cuba with the invasion at the Bay of Pigs. That's a disastrous invasion in the early days, April of 61. That's the early days of Kennedy's presidency, where Kennedy pulls back air cover in support of Cuban rebels that were trained by the CIA. Cuba had been pretty much run by American interests for a long time. In 1959, Fidel Castro takes over Cuba. He runs out the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, and then Cuba allies itself with the Soviet Union. So we've got a Soviet ally 90 miles from the southernmost tip of Florida. That comes to a head in October 62, the 13 days of the famous Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest the United States, well, really the world, has ever come to nuclear war. And so that's where the chapter ends on 882 with détente, which is a relaxation of tensions between the United States and the Soviets. That happens after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy and Khrushchev installed what's known as the hotline, which is a direct line between the White House and the Kremlin. Détente is something Richard Nixon worked on with Brezhnev in the late 60s and early 70s, and even Jimmy Carter. And then the Soviets invade Afghanistan in 79 on Christmas Day. And then détente goes away for a little bit during Reagan's term. And by the end of the 80s, the end of Reagan's presidency, the beginning of the Bush presidency, the Soviet Union pretty much ceases to exist by 91. The Berlin Wall falls in 89. So that's where the chapter's going. I uploaded a Steve Heimler video in with AP Test Review. I think that's what the channel's called in Microsoft Teams. Please watch that video. It's about 20 minutes, but it goes over the DBQ rubric, the new rubric for this year's test. It's not that different. It's same kind of information, just more chances to earn more points. I think it's a 10-point rubric. We'll talk about it. Let me know what questions you have, what concerns you have. We'll start working DBQ things probably next week. And I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.